Hey everyone, my name is Nick, and welcome back to my second attempt at filming this video. It is now once again the time of year where I disregard everything else I normally do on this channel and talk about my top 25 favorite albums of 2024. One more year and we can get some alliteration in that title. I made last year's video on a whim because I just ended a second channel dedicated to music and I still wanted a chance to talk about my favorite albums of the year. And then that video decided to blow the f*** up and became my most viewed video at the time, which is kind of crazy to think. And since a lot of you enjoyed that video, I figured I could turn this into a yearly tradition of sorts. If you weren't already familiar, most of my music taste revolves around indie, rock, pop, and electronic, and sometimes branches into metal and hip-hop, and there is hip-hop on the list this year unlike last year. And if there are any albums you think I missed, I did put some honorable mentions in the description below. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and I'll start with number 25. Up first we have Centuries with their album Snow as a Metaphor for Death. Centuries is, I believe, one person who makes music in line with bands like Idols and Squid, with a bit of a noise rock twist to spice things up. And obviously this album is pretty noisy and at times heavy as well, with nearly every track having something impressive to it, including Ding Ding Ding, which isn't even 2 minutes long. But the album really shines in the closing 13-minute title track. It goes through multiple sections that build off each other that sometimes jump from quiet to blowing up your speaker system. It's not an album for everyone, but I do highly recommend it to those who enjoy the bands I mentioned earlier, or if you're just a noise rock fan in general. At 24, we have Wall of Eyes by The Smile, who, if you didn't already know, comprise of Tom York and Johnny Greenwood of Radiohead alongside Tom Skinner of Sons of Kemet. I did enjoy the band's debut for the most part, but it did feel more like a compilation of songs than a cohesive album to me. Wall of Eyes, on the other hand, feels more direct and focused, with some fairly long songs that take a slow burn approach, especially Bending Hectic, which is probably my favorite Smile song to date. The Smile also released a second album this year, but I do think that Wall of Eyes is the better album and probably one of the better Radiohead-related albums to come out since A Moonshaped Pool. And now for something completely different.
Please, please, please.
Yeah, I enjoyed the new Sabrina Carpenter album. Fight me. Yes, I know it's a fairly basic pop album, and I know the Radiohead fans are going to kill me for this placement, but every once in a while it's nice to have a fun little pop record on in the background. Short and Sweet definitely lives up to its name, being a fairly short album that doesn't waste any time, with a nice variety of both danceable and mellow tracks. The hooks on this album are also expertly penned, and it's no wonder why Sabrina became huge this year. Sure, it's not a revolutionary album by any means, but it's still a really enjoyable time that doesn't take itself too seriously. At 22, we have A Lonely Sinner by Sam LRC, which blew up on the website Album of the Year earlier this year, and I can absolutely see why. This album is beyond impressive for one person without a record contract, and combines elements of folk and post-rock to create a really immersive experience. The instrumental palette is also really impressive, especially on the track 4M, and while I do wish the vocals were mixed a little better, the album sounds phenomenal otherwise. I'm beyond impressed by this album, but I think I'm even more excited to see where Sam goes from here, and I highly recommend it as well. It deserves as much attention as it can get.
Open up the door, can you open up?
At 21, I have Billie Eilish with Hit Me Hard and Soft, which is probably my favorite album of hers up to this point. I've always enjoyed her singles more than her full-length albums, but this feels like her most driven and cohesive album yet. She goes into several different styles throughout this album, with most of them panning out pretty well, and I was especially impressed with the first 6 tracks and how they all play off each other. The other songs, however, do drag this album down a bit for me, unfortunately, with several switch-ups that don't seem to go anywhere. I do enjoy Blue though, I do, especially during the outro. So while far from perfect, I do really enjoy the direction that Billie's taken with her music, and I hope her next album is even better. At number 20, we have No Name by Jack White, which easily had the most interesting release of the entire year. Vinyl copies of this album were randomly given out to customers of Third Man Records, with White himself then leaking the album digitally through a Google Drive link. The album then released on streaming a couple weeks later, but man, what a genius way to drop hype for an album. And thankfully, the album itself matches the hype. It's a really fun garage punk record with some of the rawest production I've heard from White. The bookends on this album are definitely the best moments here, but the rest of the album is still insanely fun. And I'm not typically a fan of Jack or the White Stripes in general, but I can't even deny how great this album is. At number 19, I have Clairo's third album, Charm. Get it? I think it even says that on the record spine. This was my first album of Clairo's, and it's one of the most soothing albums to come out this year. It's kind of a loungy record with a ton of woodwinds and strings in the mix, with Clairo's vocals coming alive despite the lo-fi production. I found myself coming back to slow dance and Add Up My Love a lot as they utilize these elements the most. And while some songs do feel a little samey, especially as you go deeper in the track list, it's still a really fun experience and is perfect for background listening.
Child of mine.
At 18, I have Patterns and Repeat by Laura Marling, which is easily one of the most comforting albums to release this year. Most of this album is stripped back with several songs only featuring guitar and vocals, but strings and horns do pop up on several songs. But the album still feels grand in scale thanks to the themes of motherhood. This is especially evident on the opener Child of Mine, which made me burst into tears the first time I heard it. I'm at a point of life where having children is the last thing on my mind, so I don't know why it affected me so much. But Laura's writing, not just on this song, but the entire record, is top-notch, with her feelings coming through in dividends. I highly recommend this one to anyone into folk music, as I guarantee you'll love this. At 17, I have My Method Actor by Nilüfer Yanya, I hope I'm saying her name right, which really surprised me when I first heard it. Based off the singles, I was expecting an upbeat indie rock record with some noisy elements, and while those elements are here, most of the album is pretty laid back and soothing at points, which is why this and the Clairo album spent a lot of time on my turntable this year. And for as subtle as a lot of this album is, the instrumentals are still pretty varied. Some moments do feel a little long, but overall, My Method Actor is a great time and is probably going to go down as one of the most underrated albums of the year. To close off the bottom 10 of this list, I have The Cure with Songs of a Lost World, an album that I'm shocked even released at all. This album had been teased for years, and it almost became a running joke as to whether it actually released or not. And even more surprisingly, it's pretty great all around. Most of this album isn't anything new for The Cure, but rather cements how great they are at writing songs even this late in their career. Every song is spacey, yet condensed at the same time, with incredible instrumentals that ring out into the distance. The length can sometimes get to you, but I'm just impressed that after 16 years of radio silence, The Cure came back and created another career highlight. I got way too many friends, I told y'all there'd be some hip-hop on this list. At 15, I have the Scrapyard mixtape from former FIFA YouTuber Quideka, who released I Didn't Mean to Haunt You, a bit of a crossover into folk a couple years back, which has now become one of my favorite albums of the decade so far. Scrapyard, however, is a collection of songs that didn't make it onto that project or wouldn't make it onto his next, and somehow even his leftovers are pretty excellent. Most of the songs here are rooted in hip-hop and R&B, with some occasional crossovers into folk, but the real highlight here is the closing track Texas Blue featuring Kevin Abstract. It's such an incredible song that really showcases how far Ben has evolved since he first started making music. The project as a whole is super fun, and I can't wait to hear his next. Next we have Shoo Shoo with 13-inch Frank Beltram Italian Stiletto. I'm not saying the rest of that title. I tried to listen to Shoo Shoo's Girl with Basket of Fruit earlier this year, and I couldn't even make it past the first track. It wasn't bad or anything, it was just overwhelming and terrifying at the same time. But this album, however, is much more accessible and goes for a more general psych rock and post-industrial sound. Most of the album is either heavy or noisy, but still contains some beautiful moments, especially on the opener. I can't guarantee that everyone will love this album, as Jamie Stewart's vocals do get a bit of getting used to, but I really enjoyed it, and it only further proves that Polyvinyl is one of the best modern record labels. Next we have Diamond Jubilee by Cindy Lee, which is now officially the longest album I've ever listened to. This double album feels like one giant nostalgia trip over something that doesn't even exist. The production feels dreamy and hazy, and thankfully doesn't tire over the runtime. The music ranges from upbeat to downtempo and continuously rewards you as you dive deeper. I think Polyphonic put it best when he said that this feels more like an experience than an album. It feels like you're trapped somewhere between fantasy and reality, with the cover art perfectly resembling this. It's definitely a long listen, but it's 100% worth your time. Oh Christ, this is next. Up next we have Knocked Loose with You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To, which is one of the most punishing albums I've ever listened to, and literally sounds like the living embodiment of burning in hell. I'm not a fan of metalcore typically, but this album really captivated me. It's a tight, 28-minute album that keeps you on your feet the entire time. And for as brutal as a lot of this album is, there's still several melodic moments throughout. So while I'm sure this isn't everyone's cup of tea, I can't help but recommend this to any metal fans. Man, the placement of these albums is giving me vertigo. At number 11, I have Bright Future by Adrianne Lenker, the lead singer of Big Thief, who also put out one of my favorite albums of the decade so far back in 2022. And like the Laura Marling album, this record is absolutely gorgeous. Lenker sings a lot about her connections to others and the world in general on this album, with some really interesting concepts, especially on evil or love backwards. It's a bit more raw than what you'd expect from Big Thief, but this album is perfectly beautiful and sad at the same time.
I've won many things I've done, but this one...
As we enter the top 10, we have another rap record, this time being Samurai by Lupe Fiasco. I randomly came across the track Cake earlier this year, and I instantly fell in love with it. Lupe's rapping is beyond smooth, and the hook is inescapably catchy. And the album in full matched the expectations I gained from the track, and has quickly become one of my favorite albums of the year. It apparently follows a hypothetical scenario where Amy Winehouse became a battle rapper, and showcases how she rose through the ranks, became famous, and then became known by her success. But you really don't need the context to enjoy the album, as it's still a very enjoyable and consistent experience.
You must have heard about me.
At number 9, I have Geordie Greep with The New Sound. Geordie is of course the former lead singer of the band Black Midi, with Geordie announcing the breakup of the band during a drunk Instagram livestream. With a typo. But now we have his first solo album, and it's pretty excellent. It takes the jazz elements of Black Midi and then adds in Latin and progressive rock elements. It also contains some of the strangest lyrics I've heard this entire year, but with a Black Midi member, you come to expect that. And while I do prefer the last two Black Midi albums to this, I still think The New Sound is a remarkable and insanely good debut album. But just be ready for something pretty weird if you do decide to give it a try. Next is another debut album, this time from The Last Dinner Party, Prelude to Ecstasy. The group combined a lot of theatrical elements with a glam rock sound to create a really fun and creative album. From the ballads to the outright rockers, every single song on here is unique and entertaining, while tackling gender norms and how unfairly some people are treated just because of how they present themselves. If you're not a fan of theater music, this album probably won't be for you, but it's still a really entertaining time. And with such a strong debut right out of the gate, I can't wait to see where this band goes from here.
Yeah, 360. Then you're in the mirror, do you like what you see?
Wow, what a surprising pick. Yes, I know, you're probably all sick of hearing about this album at this point, but there's a reason why it caught on with so many people. Charli goes down a club-influenced direction with this album, with some of her most memorable songs to date. It's pretty hard to listen to songs like Talk Talk and club classics without at least banging your head to it. But my favorite moments here are honestly the more introspective tracks, especially the Sophie tribute, So I. We may not be getting a major sonic evolution or a super serious album, but Brat doesn't need to be either of those things. It's just an incredibly fun and catchy album that's unabashedly Brat, and what else could you want from it? At number 6, we have the only returning artist from last year's video, Paranormal with Sky 100. After the Magic was a dreamy and blissful record, and while Sky 100 is also that, it's a hell of a lot noisier. This is much more of a noise pop album than a shoegaze one, but I honestly think this is Paranormal's best album yet. The songs are still absolutely stunning, with the emotion even more cutthroat than before, with a surprising amount of clarity for how loud the entire thing is. I'm unfortunately not big on the 14-minute track Evoke Me, but everything else here is absolutely golden. No pun intended. Paranormal absolutely killed it with this one, and I cannot wait for my vinyl copy to finally come in. Next, we have the new Godspeed You Black Emperor album titled No Title, as of 13th of February 2024, 28,340 dead, which is of course referring to the at the time death count of Palestinians in the ongoing war in Gaza. I usually try to stray away from modern conflicts like this on this channel because I like to use this as an escape from reality, but with an album like this, it would be foolish, if not impossible, to avoid it. Regardless of your political stance or anything, I hope that we as humans can look at a death count like this, which is now nearly doubled since, and at least agree that it's absolutely sickening. And for as grim as the reality that this album is attached to is, Godspeed created a really hopeful sounding record. A lot of this album sounds bright, like the sun rising over a broken landscape, and even the heavier moments are matched with beautiful ones that try to push away the disparity. I connected heavily with a lot of this album in the latter half of this year, and I honestly think it's the band's best since at least Don't Bend Ascend. And it serves as a reminder that despite the horrors that the world faces on a daily basis, life persists. Moving forward at number 4, I have Mount Erie's first album in 5 years, Night Palace. I really got into Phil Elverum's work this year for both Microphones and Mount Erie, and he's quickly become one of my favorite songwriters ever. And that continues for me on this 26-song beast of an album. I'm not the biggest fan of the first couple of tracks on here and how they all flow, but once you get to Broom of Wind, this album just takes off from there. There are a lot of short songs that still carry a lot of weight mixed in with much longer songs that almost feel like benchmarks for this album. I Walk, in particular, is beyond incredible, and it's probably my favorite song that Phil has ever written. From the slow intro with the lightly strummed guitars to the explosive ending on this thing, everything about this song is absolutely incredible. So while once again this is a pretty long album, it's still an incredible journey that takes you places you never expect. And it's honestly not a bad starting point if you want to get into Phil Elverum's work. At number 3, I have Beth Gibbons of the band Portishead with her album Lives Outgrown. This album was put together over the course of 10 years, and you can absolutely tell with how much was poured into every single nanosecond of this album. This entire record feels like being given life lessons by someone who's experienced it all. I especially love Lost Changes, which is probably tied with I Walk as my favorite song of the year, because of how lush, beautiful, and sweeping the entire thing is. And you can also definitely tell that Beth is in a trip-hop group because of how varied the percussion is. And even the quieter moments on this record are still blooming with sound. So with this, alongside the Adrianne Lenker and Laura Marling albums, female singer-songwriters had one hell of a year. Before I continue, just to put things in perspective, if either of these next two albums were released last year, they would have easily have taken the number 1 spot. And that's no disrespect to Javelin over here. This is still an absolutely incredible record, but it really does show how strong 2024 was for music. And case in point, Only God Was Above Us by Vampire Weekend. This album just sounds like magic with how much sound was packed into this record. This album just sounds like falling into a rabbit hole, but in the best way possible. Every single song on this album sounds sublime, and the closing track Hope is the amalgamation of all of that. This album is lush, it's upbeat, it's noisy, it's energetic, and in general, this entire thing is just brimming with life. I wasn't even a big Vampire Weekend fan before this, but this album absolutely hooked me. I was overwhelmingly confident when this came out that this would be my album of the year. But plans change. And finally, at number 1, I have Magdalena Bay with Imaginal Disc. I enjoyed their debut album Mercurial World when it came out a couple years back for the most part, but even then, I never would have expected their follow-up to be this good. They combine their synth and dance pop sounds with more progressive and psychedelic sounds to create a beyond remarkable experience. When songs like Death and Romance and Tunnel Vision come on, you can't help but be entranced by how stunning they are. Literally everything on this album is ear candy, including the interludes, with some of the most explosive pop songs of the entire year. One moment I could be rocking along, and the next I could be tearing up by how incredibly produced everything is. This really is a major accomplishment for the group, and there's really only a few other albums that make me feel as good as this album does. This is quickly becoming one of my favorite albums ever and easily takes the number 1 spot for the year, and that's some pretty tough competition. So yeah, 25 albums and 4 hours of recording later. Jesus Christ. That's my top 25 favorite albums of 2024. And before I go, I just wanted to say thank you for such an incredible year on this channel. Sure, this channel isn't huge by any means, but looking at where this channel was last year to today, we've grown quite a bit. I love making these videos no matter how stupid they are. And you know, even if this doesn't last forever, I'm going to savor every single moment of it. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed this list. Thank you all for watching, and I hope 2025 is good to all of you. Take care. And like the Laura Marling album, this album is just absolutely garbage.